I have been driving a cab in New York City for 20 years, and I have heard it all in the back seat. People crying over getting fired, people celebrating promotions, people planning affairs, and people confessing crimes that will never make it to the police. But the story you are about to hear is different from all of them. It is about a 55-year-old man who was fired in a humiliating way, escorted out by security guards like a criminal after 30 years of honest work, and who 1 year later returned to the same building not as a begging employee, but as the absolute owner. He got into my cab on a rainy night carrying an old cardboard box and an acquisition contract worth $120 million with his own name printed as the new owner of the company that had discarded him like trash. Most people, when fired at 55, sink into depression, accept that their career is over, or at most, sue for discrimination and win crumbs that do not bring back their dignity. But Richard Thompson did something no one expected. He built a silent empire in the shadows, set up a ghost consultancy financed by a Chinese billionaire, stole the best talent and clients from his old company, exposed the fraud of the CEO who humiliated him, waited for the company to implode, and bought the whole thing when it was on its knees. This is the story of how underestimated experience turns into perfectly calculated revenge, and how 30 years of knowledge can destroy 32 years of arrogance when the war is fought on the right battlefield. Fasten your seatbelt, because this ride is going to be long, and every turn in this story will make you question everything you believe about age, value, and starting over. The rain left the city with the sheen of wet asphalt when the back door of the taxi opened and a man in a suit got in clutching a cardboard box against his chest. It was not the rumpled suit of someone who just ran out of the office. It was a pressed suit, tight tie, shined shoes. But the box drew attention, old and faded, with yellowed tape holding the flaps together. He settled the box on the seat next to him with care and said firmly, "Wall Street, please. I need to get to the old Morrison and Clark building." I adjusted the rearview mirror and noticed a strange smile at the corner of his mouth, a mix of irony and satisfaction. Within the first block, he broke the silence the way people with a story to tell always do. "You know, driver, this box here is 1 year and 3 months old, and I keep it in my office closet as a souvenir." He tapped the side of the cardboard lightly. "My name is Richard Thompson, and today I return to the building where I was humiliated. But I return as the owner." I looked in the mirror, waiting for the rest, and he continued, "Let me tell you how it all started, because no one believes it when I tell this story all at once." He took a deep breath and went back in time, reconstructing that cursed Friday before Thanksgiving. Richard was 55 years old back then and had 30 years at Morrison and Clark, a financial consultancy where he had built half of the most profitable client portfolio. He said that on that day, he woke up as always, had coffee with Janet, his wife, and went to work never imagining he would come home carrying cardboard. Around 3 in the afternoon, he got an email from the CEO's assistant asking him to come to the executive conference room. When he walked in, he saw the long table, the air conditioning chilling him to the bone, and 6 younger colleagues sitting there without looking at him. There was a security guard standing near the wall, arms crossed. And that said it all. Tyler Morrison, the founder's son, 32 years old, skinny tie, and the posture of someone who never had to prove anything, spoke straight without beating around the bush, saying, "Richard, you are too expensive and too outdated for the new business model." Richard stood there processing the sentence, trying to understand if it was a bad joke. It was not. Tyler signaled the guard, who asked for his badge with an outstretched hand. Richard handed it over, and the sound of scissors cutting the plastic echoed in the room like a final sentence. No one defended him. No one protested. A colleague he had trained personally turned her face to her laptop. Another pretended to check his phone. He gathered his belongings into a box that was already there, ready, as if they knew he would not resist. When Richard finished telling that part, the taxi stopped at a light, and I turned back a little. "Mr. Richard, when they cut the badge of someone with 30 years of experience, they are cutting their own flesh without knowing it. Because a company is not a building or a logo, it is people who know how to do the job, people who deliver, people who hold on to clients when everything goes south." He smiled, touched the old box again, and said, Exactly, driver, and I kept this box precisely to remember that. But what came after that Friday was hell. The light turned green. The city continued passing outside. And I knew the next part of the story was going to be about how a 55-year-old man faces unemployment when everyone thinks his career is already over. Richard kept looking out the window as the rain let up and continued retelling it as if he needed to get it off his chest. He said that when he got home that Friday with the cardboard box, he put it on the kitchen table and stood there without the courage to speak. Janet was making dinner, turned her head and saw the box before seeing his expression. Her smile died halfway. She dried her hands on the dish towel, pulled out a chair slowly and sat in front of him. She did not make a scene, did not cry, just asked the only thing that mattered at that moment, which was how much time do we have? Richard did the math in his head, added up retirement, emergency savings, and replied, 6 months, maybe 8, if we cut everything. The following weeks turned into a routine of survival disguised as normality. Richard woke up every day at the same time, put on a suit, went down to the makeshift office in the guest room, and opened his laptop as if he still had a job. He sent out resumes like an assembly line. 10 in the morning, 15 after lunch, another 10 before dinner, 100 resumes the first week, 200 the second, 300 by the end of the month. He sent them to headhunters, direct competitors, smaller consultancies, even startups asking for an innovative and agile profile. The answers were always the same: absolute silence or that automatic email saying his profile was excellent, but did not fit their current needs. Richard shook his head inside the taxi and blurted out, 55 years old was code for too old. The cuts started coming fast, one after another, like dominoes falling. First, it was the car Janet used to go to the market and visit her mother. They sold it on a used car site for half its value. Then he canceled the golf club, $500 a month vanishing without mercy. He swapped the premium health plan for a basic one that barely covered routine exams. He cut Netflix, the gym, the Sunday paper he had read religiously for 20 years. Janet never complained, never asked for anything, but the silence between them started to weigh more than any argument. The kids called less. One lived in Boston, another in Chicago, and Richard felt they did not know what to say to a father who had always been the provider and was now breaking into pieces. But the worst part, Richard said, squeezing his fingers on the edge of the old box, was not watching the bank account shrink. The worst was going out on the street and crossing paths with neighbors. Jim, who lived 3 houses down and worked in the same sector, would cross the street when he saw Richard on the sidewalk. Carol, who always stopped to talk about her grandkids, now just waved from afar and ran into her car. Every encounter was a silent reminder that he had become the neighborhood's walking failure, and the ex-colleagues from Morrison and Clark disappeared like smoke. Calls went straight to voicemail. Messages on LinkedIn were left unread. Lunch invitations were ignored. 30 years of lunches, barbecues, holiday parties, and it all evaporated in 30 days. I slowed the taxi down at a speed bump and turned my face slightly toward him. Mr. Richard, some people go through the same thing and sink for good, but you did not sink, and do you want to know why? He looked at me waiting for the answer, and I continued, because someone who builds a 30-year career does not just build results, they build a real network. The secret is separating who is a friend of the badge and who is a friend of character. And when the dust settles, there are always 2 or 3 names left that are worth 50. Richard let out a long sigh and said quietly, I discovered that the most painful way possible. Then he started telling how he ended up in his basement, in the middle of a mess of old boxes, and found something that would change everything. Little did he know that inside one of those dusty boxes was kept the first thread of the web he was going to use to rebuild everything. Richard continued telling the story while the taxi crossed the bridge with the city lights reflecting on the dark water. He said that after 4 months of sending resumes into the void, the emergency fund was running low and desperation was starting to knock at the door. It was Janet who suggested he organize the basement and sell what they did not use anymore on eBay or at thrift stores. Old tools, college books, camping gear no one had touched in 10 years. Richard went down to the basement on a Saturday afternoon with the idea of making quick cash, but without high hopes. The place smelled of mold and old cardboard, dimly lit by a bulb hanging from the ceiling, and piles of boxes stacked with no order at all. He went opening box by box, separating what was useful from what was trash. When he found a box marked with faded blue pen writing that said, "Old Projects 1998 to 2005. Inside were folders with old contracts, yellowed receipts, business cards of people whose faces he did not even remember anymore. He was flipping through without paying much attention until a card fell on the floor. It was a simple card, thick paper, name printed in gold letters, Wei Chen, followed by an international phone number and an address in Shanghai. Richard picked up the card, wiped off the dust with his thumb, and the memory came back whole, as if it had happened yesterday. 20 years ago, Richard had been the lead consultant on a complicated project where a Chinese businessman wanted to enter the American tech market and needed someone who understood both ends. Richard set up the entire strategy, introduced the guy to the right investors, helped design the legal structure, and in 6 months, the business was up and running. Wei Chen was so impressed he offered a share in future profits, but Richard refused because at the time he was well off and did not want complications with international taxes. On the last day of the contract, Wei shook his hand firmly and said something Richard kept with him. "Richard, in China we do not forget who helps when no one believes. So if you ever need anything, call me, no matter how much time passes." Richard held the card in the basement and stared at the number as if it were a forgotten lottery ticket. Logic said the number did not work anymore, that Wei had changed phones, changed countries, maybe did not even remember him. But desperation speaks louder than logic. He went upstairs to his office, grabbed his cell phone, and dialed the international number without thinking too much. It rang 4 times, and when he was about to hang up, someone answered. The voice on the other side spoke in heavily accented English, asking, "Richard Thompson." He almost dropped the phone. Wei Chen had answered personally, remembered his name, and even more impressive, said he kept Richard's number in a special list of important contacts. I slowed down because the traffic light turned red and took the chance to turn to the back seat. "Mr. Richard, what you did has a name. It is called cultivating relationships without expecting an immediate return. Most of us only call when we need something, but you planted generosity 2 decades before harvesting. That is rare." Richard smiled, the first genuine smile since he entered the taxi, and replied, "That is right, driver. And what Wei told me on that call changed everything." He made a dramatic pause, looked at the old box on the seat, and continued. He set up a dinner in Manhattan for the following week, said he was now a billionaire, controlled gigantic funds, and was looking for opportunities in the United States. It was at that dinner that I presented the most audacious proposal of my life. The light turned green, the city accelerated around us, and I knew the next part was going to be about how an impossible call turned into the beginning of a perfectly calculated revenge. Richard straightened his posture in the seat and continued retelling as if reliving every detail. He said that the week following that call, he took the train to Manhattan on a Wednesday late afternoon. Wei Chen had set the dinner at a discreet restaurant near Times Square, one of those places without a flashy sign on the door where powerful people do business away from cameras. Richard arrived 15 minutes early, nervous as if it were a job interview. But when Wei entered the private room, everything changed. The Chinese man had gray hair at the temples, a tailored suit that probably cost more than Richard's car, but the handshake was warm and the smile genuine. He said in improved English, "Richard, you saved my business when no one bet on me. Now tell me what you need." Richard confessed to me that in that moment, he almost asked for a job, almost begged for any position in Wei's company. But something inside him, maybe wounded pride, maybe accumulated anger, made him hold his tongue and think bigger. He took a deep breath, looked Wei in the eyes, and said, "I do not want a job. I want to build a consultancy that destroys Morrison and Clark from the inside." Wei paused with his wine glass in the air, surprised, and asked him to explain. Richard told him everything: the humiliating firing, the cut badge, the 30 years thrown in the trash, the desperation of the last months. He spoke with controlled anger, the kind of anger that does not scream, but burns slowly inside. When he finished, Wei stayed silent for a few long seconds and finally spoke. "In China, we have a saying, the best revenge is not destroying the enemy, it is buying their house and charging rent." The proposal Richard presented that night was audacious, but had solid logic. He knew Morrison and Clark inside and out. He knew which clients were dissatisfied, which employees were talented but mistreated, where the company was bleeding money without realizing it. He proposed that Wei finance a competitor consultancy operating in the shadows, without his name anywhere. Everything registered through offshore accounts, shell companies, legal structures that hid the true owners. Richard would enter as a senior consultant using a fake name, hire the best professionals Morrison and Clark had discarded, and start draining clients strategically. It was not a frontal attack. It was silent, surgical sabotage, the kind that crumbles an empire before anyone realizes the foundation is rotten. Wei Chen listened to everything without interrupting, sipping his wine, eyes fixed like someone calculating invisible numbers. When Richard finished speaking, Wei asked how much he needed to start. Richard had done his homework, studied the numbers for days, and answered $5 million for the initial structure, plus a line of credit of $10 million to survive the first 6 months without profit. It was a fortune, money he would never have access to alone. Wei grabbed his cell phone, made a quick call in Mandarin, and hung up. He looked at Richard and said simply, "The money is in the account on Monday. You have 1 year to show results, and if it works, I will put in another $20 million, and we buy the whole company when it is on its knees." I slowed down because the rain came back harder and took the chance to say what I learned from years watching people rise and fall in the back seat. "Mr. Richard, you did something few people have the courage to do. You transformed humiliation into fuel without letting it turn into self-destruction, because some people become bitter, drink, give up, but you channeled the anger to build a strategy." Richard touched the old box and replied quietly, "I was lucky to find Wei, but I also had 30 years of honest work to use as a bargaining chip." He looked out the window, the lights of Wall Street already appearing on the horizon, and continued, "And what I did in the following months was set the perfect trap. A trap so silent that Tyler Morrison only noticed when the rope was already around his neck. The taxi turned the corner and the tension increased in the air, as if the next part of the story was the turning point of no return." Richard took a deep breath and continued the story, now with a firmer voice, like someone recalling small victories that turned into big ones. He said that on the Monday following the dinner, as promised, $5 million appeared in an offshore account Wei had opened in the name of a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. Richard had never seen so much money together in his life, but he did not spend a cent on luxury. He set up a discreet office in a commercial building in Newark, far from Manhattan, far from the curious eyes of Wall Street. He hired a lawyer specializing in international corporate structures who created layers and layers of shell companies. On paper, the new consultancy was called Pinnacle Advisory Group and was controlled by a Singapore fund. Richard's name appeared nowhere. The first months were silent ant work. Richard did not go around offering jobs to everyone. He made a surgical list of 15 professionals Morrison and Clark had fired in the last 3 years, or who were being mistreated, humiliated, underestimated. Good, competent people who knew how to do the job, but had been discarded because they were too expensive or did not fit the young culture. He approached each one personally, in discreet cafes, never by corporate email. The proposal was always the same: a salary 30% higher than their current one, an environment of respect, profit sharing, and freedom to work without a micromanaging boss. One by one, the best talents began to leave Morrison and Clark without making noise, as if they had simply accepted better offers in other cities. Richard said the key to the plan was total invisibility. He used a fake name in meetings, appeared as an independent senior consultant, changed his haircut, grew a gray beard, wore prescription glasses he did not need. In 6 months, no one from Morrison and Clark had connected the dots. Tyler Morrison even noticed the bleeding of talent, but thought it was a coincidence of a hot market. He fired more people thinking he was cutting costs, and every firing was an opportunity for Richard to recruit someone good who now had enough anger to want to bring down the company from the inside. Pinnacle Advisory grew slowly but solidly, with a lean, motivated team hungry to prove that experience was worth more than a pretty PowerPoint. Wei Chen visited the Pinnacle office in the 4th month and was impressed with the operation. Richard had built an efficient machine, no fat, no waste. Every hire was strategic, every process was tested, every client was approached with care. Wei looked at the numbers, saw the company was already operating in the black, and said something Richard kept: "Dumb revenge breaks both sides. Intelligent revenge builds an empire on the ashes of the enemy." He released another $3 million for expansion and gave the green light for Phase 2 of the plan, draining the most profitable clients from Morrison & Clark without leaving a trace. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw Richard smiling for the first time, showing his teeth, the kind of smile of someone who knows they played chess while the opponent played checkers. I spoke slowly, weighing my words. "Mr. Richard, you built an army before declaring war. That is pure Sun Tzu, winning the battle before fighting." He tapped the old box lightly and replied, "Exactly. And when the time came to attack the clients, I did not need to invent anything. I already knew exactly where each one was bleeding." The taxi entered the main avenue of Wall Street, giant buildings reflecting in the wet windows, and Richard leaned forward like someone getting close to the climax of the story. The next part, I already guessed, would be about how he started ripping the clients from Morrison & Clark one by one, and how Tyler Morrison finally realized he was being destroyed by a ghost he himself had created. Richard settled better into the seat, and his voice took on the tone of a strategist revealing war secrets. He said the biggest advantage he had over Tyler Morrison was not Wei Chen's money. It was not the talented team he assembled. It was something 30 years by and no MBA teaches: institutional memory. Richard knew which client liked a formal meeting and which preferred bar talk. He knew who made decisions alone and who needed to convince an entire board. He knew where the hidden dissatisfactions were, those complaints clients make in a joking tone but are actually cries for help in disguise. Morrison & Clark had kept the client portfolio on paper, but had not kept the soul of the relationships. And that was exactly what Richard turned into a weapon. The first target was Hartman Capital, a pension fund managing $8 billion that Richard had personally won over 12 years ago. The director, George Hartman, was a man of his word from the old days, one of those who still believe a handshake is worth more than a 100-page contract. Richard knew George was dissatisfied because Tyler had put a 28-year-old analyst to manage the account, and the kid treated George like a dinosaur who did not understand technology. Richard asked an independent recruiter to set up a casual lunch between George and a senior consultant who had worked years in the field. George accepted because he was curious. When Richard appeared at the restaurant with a beard, different glasses, and a suit he never used before, George took 5 seconds to recognize him, saying, "Richard, I thought you had retired." Richard smiled and replied, "Retired is for those who give up, George. I just changed my address." In 40 minutes of conversation, without forcing a sale, without a PowerPoint presentation, Richard listened to the frustrations George had been keeping for months. The new guy did not return calls, sent generic reports from a template, never asked what George really needed. At the end of lunch, George asked if Richard was accepting new clients. Richard said yes, but he needed 3 weeks to put together a personalized proposal. 3 weeks later, Hartman Capital terminated their contract with Morrison & Clark and signed with Pinnacle Advisory. Tyler Morrison called George personally, trying to understand what happened. George was polite but firm. "You guys lost the personal touch, Tyler. It is not about price. It is about who really understands my business." The second client was more painful for Tyler because it was personal. The Whitmore family had been clients since Tyler's grandfather founded the company in the 70s. They were old, conservative, suspicious of change. But Richard knew something Tyler ignored because he never paid attention. The matriarch of the family, Dorothy Whitmore, 82 years old, hated being treated as incapable. Tyler made the classic mistake of talking to her grandkids as if the old lady was not in the room, as if she were a museum piece that signs where told. Richard asked for a meeting directly with Dorothy at her house on a Saturday morning. He went alone, brought simple flowers, and spent 2 hours talking about the investments she wanted to make, not the ones the grandkids thought she should make. Dorothy looked at him at the end and said, "It has been 20 years since anyone treated me as if I still had a working brain." 1 month later, $60 million migrated to Pinnacle Advisory. I took advantage of the traffic dying down and said what I always say to people building a business from zero. Mr. Richard, what you did has a name in the market: relationship selling. It is not selling a product, it is selling trust built brick by brick. A big client does not switch providers for a 10% discount. They switch because they feel they became a number on a spreadsheet. Richard slapped his hand on the old box and agreed. Exact. And the third client I took was the blow that made Tyler Morrison understand this was not a coincidence. It was the blow that started the panic. The taxi turned onto the street where the old Morrison and Clark building was, and Richard paused the story at the tensest moment, that moment where the enemy finally realizes he is surrounded, but still does not know by whom. The next part, I already knew, would be about how Tyler discovered there was a ghost destroying his company, and how that ghost had a first and last name he knew very well. Richard pulled the box closer to his chest and continued with that tone of someone getting to the best part of the story. He said the third client was Apex Industries, a tech giant worth $3 billion, representing 15% of Morrison and Clark's annual revenue. When Apex announced they were ending the contract, Tyler Morrison went into total panic. He called an emergency meeting, offered absurd discounts, ordered the vice president to beg on his knees. The CEO of Apex, James Chen, was polite but firm. "You guys lost your touch. It is not about price, it is about trust." Tyler asked if there was another company involved. James did not answer, but he did not need to. The next day, Pinnacle Advisory announced a strategic partnership with Apex Industries. Richard said at that moment Tyler threw his computer against the wall and screamed that someone was sabotaging his company. That was when Tyler made the fatal mistake. That mistake arrogant people always make when desperate. He thought the enemy was outside when actually it was inside. He hired external auditors to search everything, looking for leaks, corporate espionage, anything to explain the bleeding of clients. He did not hire normal compliance auditors who do a review and pretend everything is fine. He hired Deloitte Forensics, the same team that takes down corruption schemes in multinationals. The briefing Tyler gave was clear: find who was passing information to the competition. He was so focused on looking for external betrayal that he did not realize he was opening his own drawers to strangers. And when you open a drawer that has been closed too long, there is always a rotten surprise waiting. The auditors spent 6 weeks searching emails, contracts, bank transfers, investment spreadsheets. They reviewed the last 5 years of operations, and they did not find corporate espionage. They found something infinitely worse: embezzlement of funds. Tyler Morrison, the young CEO who thought himself a disruptive genius, had done the most idiotic and classic thing an arrogant executive does. He used client money to cover personal bets that went wrong. He had invested $3 million of fiduciary funds in crypto startups that went bankrupt in 6 months. He covered the hole by taking money from new contracts, creating an internal Ponzi scheme where he hoped future profits would offset past losses. Only the profits never came, the clients started to leave, and the house of cards was one breath away from collapsing. Richard smiled when he got to this part of the story and said he knew about the audit even before Tyler knew the results. He had kept contact with 3 key people who were still inside Morrison and Clark, people who had been humiliated by Tyler but did not have the courage to leave. One of them was an executive assistant with access to everything. When the preliminary report arrived on the board's desk, an unofficial copy arrived in Richard's encrypted email 2 hours later. He read it in the Pinnacle office, and for the first time in months, smiled for real. He hung himself, Richard said out loud. Weichin was in the room and just commented, "Arrogance is the most expensive tuition you never finish paying." Richard did not just want to destroy Tyler socially, he wanted legal justice, the kind that comes with handcuffs and headlines. The taxi stopped at a light 3 blocks from the final destination, and I turned back, because I needed to say what I had been thinking since the beginning of the story. "Mr. Richard, some people confuse revenge with justice. Revenge is breaking someone because you are angry. Justice is guaranteeing the person reaps exactly what they planted. You did not invent any fraud. You just turned on the light in a dark room." Richard nodded and touched the old box one last time before continuing. "Exactly. And what I did with that report was simple. I assembled a complete dossier, gathered old emails I had kept, documents proving a pattern of misconduct, and handed it all to someone who could actually do something." The light turned green. The Morrison and Clark building appeared on the corner with the name still lit on the facade, and Richard prepared to tell how the public fall of Tyler Morrison happened faster than an avalanche. Richard was almost at the end of the ride, and his voice gained that rhythm of someone recounting the best play of the game. He said he took the complete dossier, 200 pages of evidence organized like a prosecutor's indictment, and took it to a lawyer specializing in white-collar crimes. The lawyer looked at the material, spent 3 hours reading document by document, and finally spoke. "This right here means jail time." Richard asked what the next step was. The lawyer replied, "SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, and it has to be anonymous because if they find out it was you, they will try to destroy your credibility before the trial." Richard did not need credit. He needed results. The complaint was delivered on a September morning via tracked mail to the regional SEC office in New York. The SEC does not play around with this kind of thing. In 48 hours, they opened a formal investigation. In 1 week, they subpoenaed Tyler Morrison and the entire board of Morrison and Clark to testify. Richard watched it all from afar, reading the news that started leaking to the financial press. The headlines appeared one after another. Traditional consultancy under federal investigation for possible fraud. SEC investigates millionaire embezzlement at Morrison and Clark. Morrison family faces biggest crisis in 5 decades of history. Tyler tried to control the narrative, gave interviews saying it was a misunderstanding, that he trusted the auditors, that he would cooperate fully. But when you have your hand in the cookie jar and everyone saw you, it is no use saying you were just counting how many were left. The effect was instant and brutal. Institutional investors started pulling money before the market even closed. Clients who still remained sent formal letters terminating contracts due to circumstances of compromised reputation. Banks financing operations froze credit lines. The board of shareholders called an emergency meeting and, by unanimous vote, removed Tyler Morrison from the CEO position, removed his father from the advisory board, and put in a temporary caretaker to try and save what was left. Tyler tried to give an interview to the press, saying it was persecution, that he had powerful enemies. But conspiracy theories do not stick when you are formally accused by the federal government with documented proof. It looked exactly like what it was, the desperation of a guilty man trying to buy time. Richard said that in 3 months, the company plummeted from a $300 million valuation to less than $50 million. Regional offices closed, half the staff resigned. Entire floors of the iconic building in Midtown sat empty with the lights off. It was the kind of silence dead companies leave behind, and it was at this moment that Wei Chen called Richard and said something that changed the final objective. "Destruction is easy, Richard. Acquisition is power." He was right. Destroying Tyler Morrison was personal justice. Buying the company that discarded Richard was a historic statement. It was writing his name in permanent letters on the wall that tried to erase him. We put the lawyers to monitor the bankruptcy process that would inevitably come. The taxi parked in front of the building and I turned off the engine, but neither of us made a move to get out. I needed to say what was on the tip of my tongue. "Mr. Richard, the difference between revenge and reconstruction is this. Revenge ends when the enemy falls. Reconstruction ends when you take the throne that was his." Richard looked up at the mirrored glass building with the Morrison and Clark sign still lit, and smiled that way of someone who knows the story has not ended yet. "That is right, driver. And when the company was on its knees, no clients, no money, no future, that was when I made the offer they could not refuse. The rain had stopped completely, the city was breathing again, and I knew the next part would be about how Richard returned to the building, not as a humiliated employee carrying a cardboard box, but as the absolute owner ready to rewrite the whole story. Richard leaned forward in the seat, eyes fixed on the building outside, and continued retelling as if he were reliving every second. He said that in December, exactly 1 year and 2 months after the humiliating firing, the board of shareholders of Morrison and Clark received a formal proposal. An international consortium of investors, led by holdings based in Singapore and Delaware, offered $60 million to buy 100% of the company's shares, assume all debts, and restructure the operation completely. Did the board have other options? None. No other investor wanted to touch that burned name. No bank would offer financing to save a company under federal investigation. It was accept or close the doors and send everyone home without severance. The board voted on a Friday afternoon. Unanimous. They signed the contract without even properly investigating who was behind the consortium. The following Monday, Richard entered that same building, not through the employee door, but through the executive elevator. He was accompanied by 3 corporate lawyers, 2 restructuring consultants, and Wei Chen, who had come personally from Singapore to witness the historic moment. The temporary caretaker waited at the reception of the 12th floor with signed contracts, master keys, and a complete list of assets. He shook Richard's hand with the tired expression of someone who knew he was handing over a corpse, still warm, saying, "Good luck, Mr. Caldwell. You are going to need it." Richard smiled politely, but did not answer. Luck is for those who did not plan every step. He went straight up to the internal auditorium and called a mandatory general meeting with the 43 employees still remaining from a staff that once had 200. When everyone sat down, Richard did not start with a corporate presentation full of slides and empty promises. He started with the truth. "My name is Richard Thompson. I worked at this company for 30 years. I was fired 1 year and 3 months ago in an unjust and humiliating way, and now I have returned as the owner." The silence was so heavy you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Some recognized him immediately and whispered among themselves. Others were too new to remember. Richard continued, "I know you are afraid of losing your jobs, afraid this place will close for good. But I did not buy this company for money. I bought it because this place was my home for 3 decades, and I saw incompetent people destroy everything. Whoever is good at what they do stays. Whoever is loyal and competent will be promoted. Whoever is incompetent or complicit in the mess will be fired today." Right after the meeting, Richard sent for Tyler Morrison. Yes, Tyler was still in the building, trying to mount a desperate legal defense against federal charges that could yield up to 15 years in prison. When the secretary called warning that the new owner wanted to see him, Tyler came down the elevator with the stiff posture of someone who knows he is going into a battlefield unarmed. He entered the executive meeting room, that same one where he had fired Richard, and found Richard sitting at the head of the table, exactly in the chair that used to be Tyler's. Richard did not get up. He just looked at him in silence for 10 whole seconds, letting the discomfort grow. Tyler asked, trying to sound firm but failing, "You planned all this, did not you?" Richard tilted his head slightly. "Planned? No. You planned your own ruin when you decided stealing from clients was an acceptable way to cover your idiotic bets. I just gave a little help so the right people would find out." Richard said he offered Tyler a way out, sign a voluntary cession of all shares, formally renounce any link to the company, and in exchange, Richard would not enter as a federal witness in his trial. Or Tyler could refuse, try to fight in court, and Richard would personally hand the prosecutors every email, every memo, every recorded conversation proving Tyler knew exactly what he was doing. Tyler signed on the spot, without reading, without negotiating. He just signed and left the room without looking back. I took a deep breath and spoke softly, because I needed to name what I had just heard. "Mr. Richard, you did not destroy the enemy. You handed back to him the same cardboard box he gave you." Richard touched the old box on the seat next to him, the one he kept as a silent trophy, and replied, "Exactly. And what happened after that was reconstruction. But before rebuilding, I had to do one last thing." The taxi door opened. The cold night air came in, and I knew the story was reaching the end. That ending where justice meets redemption. Richard straightened his posture and continued telling with a calmer voice now, like someone who passed the revenge part to the reconstruction part. He said that in the days following the acquisition, He had to make the hardest decisions of his life. He had 43 remaining employees, and he knew not all deserved a second chance. He spent 3 days doing individual meetings, reviewing each one's history, talking to people still inside the company who knew what happened backstage. It was not a witch hunt. It was a character audit. Richard separated the employees into 2 groups: those who were complicit in Tyler Morrison's toxic culture, who humiliated colleagues, who pulled the rug out, who laughed when someone older was fired, and those who were just people trying to survive, paying bills, supporting families, doing honest work even inside a rotten environment. The first group was fired without ceremony, but with full legal severance. Richard did not want labor lawsuits, did not want headlines saying the new owner was vengeful. He just called each one, explained there was no space for those who built a career on other people's humiliation, and handed over a termination letter with 3 months' notice. Some tried to argue, others left in silence, but everyone understood that was not negotiable. The second group, those who survived with their dignity intact, received a different proposal: an immediate salary increase of 20%, a clear career plan, and profit sharing if the company went back to growing. Richard said he wanted to build a place where experience was valued, not punished, where a mistake was an opportunity to learn, not a reason for summary dismissal. But the decision that had the most impact was bringing back the professionals Tyler had discarded due to ageism. Richard personally called 15 people who had been fired in the last 3 years. People 50, 60 years old, who had given decades to the company and were thrown away like old trash. He offered not only their jobs back, but better positions, with real autonomy and guaranteed respect. Some were suspicious at first, thinking it was a prank or an empty promise. But when they saw Richard had put his own name on the line, that he had bought the whole company to prove a point, 8 of them came back. And those 8 became the backbone of the new culture Richard was building. People who knew how to do the job, who had battle scars, who did not need micromanagement because they had seen it all. Richard said that in 6 months the company was operating better than in the last 3 years under Tyler's management. Old clients came back, new clients appeared attracted by the reputation of seriousness that spread in the market. Revenue doubled in the first year. He changed the company name to Caldwell Advisory Group, erasing the surname Morrison from the facade for good. He hired Linda, the one who had been fired with him, as director of operations. He promoted Marcus, who had been demoted by Tyler, to vice president. And he created a mentorship program where senior professionals trained the younger ones, reversing the idiotic logic that youth is worth more than experience. Wei Chen visited the office at the end of the first year, saw the numbers, and said something Richard never forgot. "You did not buy a company, Richard. You bought the opportunity to prove you were right the whole time." I turned off the engine completely and turned to the back seat because I needed to say what had been hammering in my head since the beginning of this ride. "Mr. Richard, some people, when they gain power, use it to destroy who destroyed them. But you used it to rebuild what was broken. That is rare. That is true leadership." Richard held the old cardboard box in his lap, the one he kept as a permanent souvenir, and smiled tiredly. "You know, driver, I could have fired everyone, closed the company, sold the assets, and pocketed the difference. But then I would be just like Tyler. And I spent a whole year proving I was different." He looked up at the building where the name Caldwell shone now on the facade and continued. "But there was one last thing I needed to do before considering this story closed. There was one last meeting I needed to have. And I knew by the tone of his voice that this last meeting would be the closure every good redemption story needs." Richard stayed silent for a few seconds, looking at the building, and when he spoke again, his voice had a different weight, as if the next part of the story was the most important of all. He said 3 years passed since that day he signed the purchase of the company. 3 years rebuilding, hiring, training, proving to the market that experience combined with humility was worth more than juvenile arrogance. Caldwell Advisory Group was now worth $140 million, 3 times more than Morrison and Clark was worth before imploding. Richard did not work 12 hours a day anymore. He had passed the baton to a new generation he trained personally and finally could breathe without carrying a weight on his back. But there was one thing that still bothered him, a conversation that had never really happened. Tyler Morrison had been tried 18 months after the formal SEC accusation, in a federal court in Manhattan packed with journalists and onlookers. The jury took 6 hours to declare him guilty on all charges: accounting fraud, embezzlement, obstruction of justice. The judge, during sentencing, said something that got etched in the headlines: "You did not just steal money, you stole trust. And trust is the only asset that never completely recovers." Tyler was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole, plus $17 million in restitution. Richard watched the verdict on the office TV, arms crossed, without celebrating. Justice had been done, but it did not bring the feeling of closure he expected. 2 weeks ago, Richard received a letter. Not an email, not a message, a physical handwritten letter, mailed from a penitentiary in Connecticut. It was from Tyler Morrison. The letter had 3 pages. Shaky handwriting, apologizing, acknowledging mistakes, asking if Richard would accept a visit one last time before he completed half his sentence and was transferred. Richard read the letter 3 times, showed Janet, talked to Wei Chen, and finally decided, yes, he would go. Not because Tyler deserved it, but because Richard needed to say personally everything he had held in for 3 years. He scheduled the visit for that same week, took the old cardboard box he kept in his office, and took a taxi to the penitentiary on a Tuesday morning. The visiting room was like every prison room in the movies: metal table bolted to the floor, uncomfortable chairs, thick glass separating visitor from inmate. Tyler walked in wearing an orange jumpsuit, gray hair at the temples, shoulders slumped, 40 pounds lighter. He sat on the other side and stared at his own hands, unable to lift his face. Richard placed the old cardboard box on the table, right in front of the glass, and waited. Tyler finally looked up, saw the box, and his eyes filled with tears. He tried to speak, but his voice failed. Richard leaned forward and said slowly, every word measured, "This box here is 3 years and 2 months old. I keep it in my office as a reminder that humiliation can be fuel or it can be poison. I chose to turn it into fuel. You chose to swallow the poison and poison everyone around you." Richard said he stayed 40 minutes in that room, speaking without shouting, without cursing, just letting out everything he had held back. He spoke about the 30 years of dedication thrown in the trash, about the months of unemployment, about the shame of facing his wife, about the neighbors who looked away. But he also spoke about the reconstruction, about the company that now bore his name on the facade, about the clients who came back because trust cannot be bought with a discount, about the older employees who were rescued from forced retirement. When he finished, Tyler asked softly if Richard forgave him. Richard took a deep breath, looked at the cardboard box between them, and replied, "Forgiving does not mean forgetting. It means I do not carry anger anymore. You will carry the consequences for the rest of your life. I will carry the lessons." He got up, took the box, and left without looking back. When he got back to the taxi that morning, he finally felt the story had truly ended. Richard fell silent for a moment after telling about the prison visit, and finally took a deep breath like someone who just took a decades-old weight off their shoulders. He looked at the old cardboard box he was still holding in his lap and said, "And today, 3 years and 2 months after that cursed Friday, I come back to this building every day. Not because I need to prove anything to anyone anymore, but because finally it is truly mine." His voice sounded different now, without anger, without bitterness, just with the tranquility of someone who knows the journey was worth every scar. The taxi was stopped in front of the building. The rain had stopped completely, and the lights of Wall Street reflected in the puddles on the sidewalk. He said that today, Caldwell Advisory Group employs 120 people, half of them over 45, people who were discarded by other companies and found a second chance there. The culture he built was simple: respect for experience, room for mistakes, and zero tolerance for humiliation. Clients came back not because he offered a discount, but because trust takes years to build and seconds to destroy, and Richard knew how to build slowly and with a solid foundation. Wei Chen continues as a silent investor, visiting twice a year, always impressed with how Richard turned revenge into a sustainable empire. And the cardboard box. It remains in his office, inside a glass cabinet, as a permanent trophy of the day his life turned upside down. Richard held the door handle but did not open it yet. He turned to me and said, "You know, driver, when you get fired at 55, everyone looks at you as if your life is over, as if you were an old horse that is no good for racing anymore. But the truth is that experience does not get old, it ripens. And maturity, when combined with strategy and patience, always beats arrogance with haste." I turned off the meter, turned completely to the back seat, and said what had been stored since the beginning of this ride. "Mr. Richard, you did not need to tell me this whole story, but now I understand why you told it. You needed to remind yourself where you came from before walking in there as the owner." He smiled in that way of someone who knows they have been read completely and replied, "Exactly. Every day before going up, I stop for a minute and remember the cardboard box, the cut badge, the security guards escorting me. Not to stay angry, but to remember that humility and respect are not optional. They are mandatory. Because the day I become Tyler Morrison, someone will do to me what I did to him." Richard opened the door, took the old box carefully, and before leaving left a $100 bill on the seat. "Keep the change, driver. And thanks for listening." He got out, crossed the wet sidewalk, and entered the building where the name Caldwell shone on the glass facade. I sat there for a few more minutes, watching him disappear into the illuminated lobby, and thought about all the stories I have already heard in this back seat. Stories of people who gave up, of people who sank, of people who blamed the whole world and never got up. But also stories like Richard's, rare but real, of people who turned a fall into a trampoline, who used humiliation as raw material for reconstruction. I started the engine again, adjusted the rearview mirror, and went back into New York traffic, carrying the certainty that I just witnessed living proof that experience, when treated with respect and used with wisdom, never gets old. It only becomes more valuable. And while the city continued running outside, indifferent as always, I knew this story was going to stay with me for a long time, maybe forever. The cardboard box Richard carried had more value than all the diplomas hanging on the corporate walls of Wall Street, because that box represented something no business school teaches. That humiliation can turn into fuel when you have the patience to distill anger into strategy. Richard spent a year and 3 months planning every move, building himself in the shadows, draining clients with surgical precision, until finally buying the whole company for a third of the original value. And he did all that without shouting, without suing, without becoming a newspaper headline. He just proved in the most deafening silence possible that 30 years of experience destroy 32 years of arrogance when the battle is played on the field of real competence, not on the field of a pretty PowerPoint. Now I ask you, have you ever been discarded for being too expensive or too outdated? Have you seen younger and less competent people take your place while you watched from the sidelines? Have you swallowed anger thinking your career was over just because the calendar reached a number the market decided is old? If you answered yes, this story is for you to understand that the game only ends when you decide to stop playing. Clients do not buy youth, they buy results. And results come from those who have already failed, already fixed it, already delivered 1,000 times. If this story touched you, if it made you rethink the value of your experience, smash that like button now and share with someone who needs to remember that a fresh start has no expiration date. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, because every week I bring real stories from my taxi that show the side of corporate life no one tells. Comment, fresh start, if you believe it is never too late to turn the game around. See you on the next ride.